And welcome everybody to the Weird Research or How to Think New Thoughts, HRI/PRI Symposium. Thank you very much to the HRI, the Humanities Research Institute at Brock, for providing us with this opportunity to discuss our research methods, weird or not so weird, or this is what we're going to be discussing here today. First, I would like to start with acknowledging that the land on which Brock University is situated is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. I can't take too much time to get into everything that needs to be thought through about the land acknowledgement, but I invite you to individually think of the land where you are situated, and what history, what past and contemporary beings you share the land with, and to whom thanks are due and acknowledgements are due. We have members of the panel who are situated in different locations as far as Alberta, for example, and so the land, the specific land that needs to be acknowledged is different right there. So today, what we wanted to do was to discuss alternative or dissonant research methods. You have read the rationale for the symposium, and this is why you're here, I'm thinking. And you're here because you're interested in the notion of weird research. So today we have presenters who engage in dissonant, weird research methods. Weird because they themselves consider it to be weird, or because other people think what they're doing is weird. So what will happen is that they will speak about their methodological approach and provide examples of weirding research. And they will discuss how it has impacted what thoughts think thoughts in their work. After the presentations and the questions and comment period following the last presentations, we will stop the recording, but we will then use breakout rooms to engage with you and share experiences and ideas. As you listen to the presentations, I invite you to think of that exercise ahead. We will seek your input for a planned weird research manifesto that we will be collaboratively working on after the event. So I would invite you to ask yourself the following three questions. What counts as weird? What does weird do that non-weird does not? And why be weird? Or why weird research? What's the purpose? Okay, so without further ado, I will give the floor to Ada Jaarsma from Montreal University Philosophy Department to speak about weird pedagogies. Ada.
Thank you so much. Let me just bring up my slides. I'm going to dive right in. My talk is called Weird Pedagogies, and I'm going to begin with a claim from our group abstract for this event. It matters what methods generate thoughts. And I want to begin by noting that this is a claim about weirdness, and that in itself is a bit striking or weird. It emerges out of a backdrop, namely the university, in which this claim stands out because it contrasts with non-weirdness. And we can find this contrast all across the university, from the sciences to the social sciences to philosophy to administration, even to granting agencies. Let's look at the image here on the left. You have likely encountered this impressively non-weird researcher recently, I suspect, on campus, in classrooms, because they're everywhere, taking up space, seeming to be alone, indeed very alone, because one of their identifying features is the ability to show that they are not influenced by others or by their identity or even by their own interests. In contrast with, let's look at the image on the right, these researchers are not alone. In fact, they're enjoying the company of lots of different colors, tones, sizes. But back to the image on the left, though, this non-weird researcher is alone precisely because their knowledge practices lay claim to authority that does not stem from persuasion or other influences. It's not a placebo. It's not made up. My results and my knowledge claims are real and verifiable. This is my favorite mantra of non-weirdness. As the wonderfully weird philosopher Isabel Stengers points out, in fact, though, these non-weird researchers are not alone. They're very busy, excluding each other, for example, for having methods that pollute their findings. The scientist laughing at the psychoanalyst, who's laughing back at the physicist. And what unites them, though, is that they can celebrate their shared contrast with the weirdos, the charlatan, the magician, who of course is happily using placebos, the charismatic teacher. To be a weird researcher, in contrast, is to affirm a multiplicity of methods. And I really mean affirm, and that's what I want to be thinking about here together with you. Consider a few weird books. Oops, let me go back. Here we go. A world of many worlds, the different modes of existence, the body multiple. Weirdness affirms the coexistence of methods and therefore affirms transdisciplinarity. We can even hold out hope that the university is a place to access many universes. This is a picture of my own greenhouse, which is filled with tomatoes. There is one, here's my main claim for my talk today. There's one overlooked figure on campus who understands weirdness in especially astute ways, namely the undergrads. I first discovered tomatoes, which is the image I've been using so far, as a motif or a placeholder for teachers. I first discovered this via an undergrad who was actually a fictional undergrad in the novel On Duty, written by Zadie Smith. Her name is V. And she has such brilliant insight about weirdness. Here's how it goes. She moves from classroom to classroom, and she can identify each and every different tomato being enacted by each professor. And so I began to work with this motif, and I quickly discovered a lot more about tomatoes because of more undergrads. And so as what happened, as I started working with tomatoes, the students around me started creating portraits of their own teachers. This tomato, that tomato, and each tomato has their own relationship to placebos, from banishing them to conjuring them to using them very happily. Here's a couple of examples. You know how I began with that non-weird researcher taking up space, laying claim to authority? Here we might give that teacher a name. The tomato was in outer space. And even this non-weird researcher actually starts to look pretty weird from the vantage point of the undergrad. Outer space, no taste, no smell, just the all-knowing professor. The analytic professor in grad school was my main example, my main encounter with the tomato was in outer space. I've come to learn that this tomato is also very common, the tomato that does not want to be tomato. And these are my portraits, by the way. So this one is made up of lemon fabric. So this tomato is just passing through, doesn't want to be a tomato. Hi, students. Okay, bye. And this is the tomato, the GMO tomato that I think most of our administrators and managers would like to see. One size fits all. Cram as many students as you can into the classroom because the vibe doesn't matter. It's basically a factory. And then this is my own tomato. So this is my self-portrait as a teacher, the meta tomato, hopefully the self-consciously weird teacher. Because I made this, so I can tell you it's made up of all tomato fabric. And part of the shtick of this tomato is trying to cultivate a sense in the classroom that there are many tomatoes. Down the hall, another universe is being opened up. And over there, another universe is opening up. So both senses are happening. We are made up of tomatoes, and let's remember that there are many tomatoes. And so where does that leave us? What would be a way to sum up weird pedagogy? So this is my conclusion. I have 4 answers. Number 1, with affirming transdisciplinarity. Number 2, with a mantra that is excited about placebos and other influencing factors like curiosity, interest, passion, our embodied identities, instead of trying to banish these influences. Number 3, with a sense of community that is inclusive and not exclusionary. And number 4, above all, with an appreciation of undergrads, who are, I think, the most adept of anyone else on campus with negotiating the different modes and methods of knowledge production. This is who I think we need to listen to in order to learn even more about weirdness. And I will end right there.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. I will say I'm pleasantly surprised by the presence of tomatoes. I didn't expect that. So wow, this is a great start, I think. So next up for a presentation is Jane Baker from the Studies in Comparative Literature and Arts program. And Jane is going to talk to us about the resonance of becoming. Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right, I'll just get right into it. So in this work, I claim that the vibrational resonance of the singing voice is capable of producing a way of being which exists as a subject. This subject is not bound by the Western or Eurocentric model of a universal subjectivity which exists as a status of mastery, but instead is a being that exists in a constant state of becoming. In the traditional conception, the mind is favored over the body. The subject is distinct and opposed to the object. Instead of there being an oppositional tension and asymmetrical binary, the subject I'm describing is one that does not lean to one side or the other, but neutrally and permanently relishes in the state of becoming. This project will involve my own experience as a singer, and through this I aim to theorize embodiment without rigidifying the body into a predetermined concept, but rather to conceptualize the potentialities of the human being in terms of the singing voice. I do not want to imply that the concept is something that is discovered rather than something that is invented. The concept is not transcendent, but it is a productive fabulation that holds water until it evolves. In this paper, I claim that we can conceive of the singing voice as being not only generative of vocality itself, but that it is also a constitutive factor in the formation of subjectivity. This subjectivity is not a fixed or rational one. It is always in the process of forming and perpetually in flux. It is continuously constituting itself as it becomes itself. This thought allows us to formulate the question of what singing does for subjectivity rather than what it is to the subject. Also, I would like to note that this paper is part of a larger project, and due to its length, the complexity of many of these concepts and claims are not able to be fully articulated and contextualized. But I hope to be able to adequately gesture toward and encourage, as Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari would say, potential lines of flight. Not only is vibration and resonance integral in the production of the singing voice, it is also a necessary factor in the anatomy of the listener to be able to hear the singing voice. The sound waves of the voice cause the eardrum to vibrate, and that vibration is then sent to 3 tiny bones in the middle ear. But as I continue to formulate these concepts, we will see that these vibrations are not something that merely happens to or in the listener. But it constitutes an active relation to the sound as a kind of intensity. In other words, the hearing of sound does not only exist in the anatomical and physical vibrations of the eardrum and those tiny bones, but it is experienced by the listener as an affective intensity. For this paper, it is important to distinguish between affect and emotion in order to further explore the concept of affectivity and how it relates to the human being and the resonance of the human voice. By emphasizing affect instead of and resisting an identity of the human being as an subject who experiences specific emotions, and instead I am referring to the pre-individual intensities of affect. According to Brian Masumi in the introduction of Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus, affect is different than a personal feeling. It is a, quote, pre-personal intensity corresponding to the passage from one experiential state of the body to another, end quote. An affect has yet to be defined in terms of its association with a state of experience that would then determine it to be a kind of emotion. To describe the relation and interaction between the listener and the sound as resonance, I will bring in the conception of the human body as an affective sensorium as articulated by Steve Goodman in Sonic Warfare. In this text, Goodman investigates various ways in which the human senses and is affected by sound. With this articulation, I am being cautious to not posit the body as being something separate from the mind in order to not reinstate the Cartesian binary I seek to evade, and to instead think of the body as a kind of, as Goodman puts it, transducer of vibration, rather than an inert and detached listener. Although Goodman is referring to sound, I believe that these concepts of affective intensities can be extended in relation to the singing voice. Goodman points out that in sonic phenomena such as the Doppler effect, it is not the sound itself that changes, nor is it the body of the listener, but rather it is, quote, the relation between the observer and the emitting object that is modified, end quote. With this conception, the human body is not a passive listener or a mere receiver of sound, but it is a multifaceted sensory apparatus, or in other words, an affective sensorium. He then uses the example of an echo to say that an echo is only possible when there is a distancing of two surfaces between which the sound can bounce back and forth. He clarifies that the sound of the echo is not produced by resonating on either of the walls, but rather it comes to be as it fills the emptiness that separates them. It is not a simple back and forth between each side, but it is a complex event without any gaps. It is a self-constituting and continuous movement of sound waves that simultaneously creates and becomes the sound of the echo we hear. It is an immediate self-relation that converts the emptiness into intensity. Further, Goodman will say that, quote, the affective sensorium of an entity becomes a rhythmic transducer composed of not just the 5 exterioceptive channels that open onto the external environment, but also the viscerality of interoception, which is sensitive to intensity minus quality, end quote. Here, it is important to indicate that I take this to be referring to the intensity of affect rather than the quality of emotion. Goodman continues this statement saying, quote, there is a visceral perception initiated by a sound, and in a split second, the body is activated by the sonic trigger. The gut reaction is preempting consciousness, end quote. In my reading, that gut reaction refers to the register of intensity as a kind of affect, as affect preempts the consciousness needed to assign a particular feeling to a specific emotion. The human entity as an affective sensorium does not only sense what is directly listened to, but it is sensitive to the intensity of vibration, which is yet to be heard as a discernible sound. Thus, the affective sensorium does not respond to what is actually heard rather than what is virtually silent, but it is continuously involved with both. With these claims, instead of speaking about sound and silence, which implies a binaristic opposition between the two, I will be utilizing the conception of the virtual and the actual as articulated by Deleuze and Guattari. With this notion of the virtual and the actual in mind, I extend Goodman's conclusion that, quote, the tension between transsensoriality and the sonic produces the concept of unsound, the not yet audible, the dimension of sonic virtuality, end quote. This sonic virtuality is not a blank or empty silence, nor is it the complete opposite of actual sound, but it is a perpetual potential that is mutually constitutive of and spills into the actual of audible sound. To relate these points back to the act of singing and subjectivity, I will invoke Henri Bergson's concept of filtering, with which he claims that we do not perceive anything in its entirety, but rather our perception is conditioned by what is in our interest to perceive, determined by our psychological dispositions. This filtering plays a role in shaping, crystallizing, and rendering actual that affective intensity in such a way that cannot be reduced to only a singular or predetermined emotional state. According to Deleuze and Cinema 2, for Bergson, all perception is already caught up in this filtering, and, quote, attentive recognition does not extend into movement, but enters into relation with a recollection image that it calls up, end quote. This relation is not one that implies a separation, but it is a relation between the virtual and the actual, and the recollection image fills the gap in that relation. The recollection image is always moving in relation to the past, present, and future potentialities, which in turn results in the emergence of a subjectivity that does not exist statically or offer up the possibility for objective or fully actualized perceptual experience, but it is in a state of continuous becoming and always is in the realm of the virtual. With these theorizations in mind, I would like to consider myself as a modulating organism with a voice box that plays the role of filtering, shaping, and rendering actual the virtual affect of the resonating singing voice. By drawing on my own experience as a singer, I will develop a practical methodology to inform and develop these inquiries. Further, I want to explore the act of singing in relation to silence in terms of phrasing and breath. The breath as the mediator with the body, as the bellows which provide an opportunity for the sonic to emerge, while at the same time having its own kind of sounding, as being a kind of intermediality between the expressivity of the body as well as vocality and a quality of agency and intent. With this, I claim that the breath occupies the space of the virtual. It is not the opposite of the voice, but it simultaneously produces and overflows into the voice. Just like the relation between the virtual and the actual, the breath anticipates the voice, and the voice in turn anticipates breath. From here, I claim that the breath is the virtual component that constitutes and spills into the actual of the singing voice. And it is in this continuous production of the song that the subject is constituted as a flexible entity in and as the relation to the sonic resonance it simultaneously generates and perpetually becomes. I've claimed in previous work that in my experience of singing, I have felt that there are no explicitly intentional or external movements involved in singing, but there is a vibration that permeates through and out of my body. It is a constant movement as a pulsating expulsion. I would like to continue this claim by saying that the vibrational resonance of the voice works to bind and constitute the subject, but in a movement that allows for modulation and perpetual becoming self. And in reiteration of a point I made earlier, this subjectivity is one that goes against the conceptions of the rational, stable, universal subject, and is one that allows for fluctuation and a continuous unfolding of being. It is always in the space of the virtual and overflowing into the actual, but never fully formed as an objective or concretized being. I'm reclaiming subjectivity as an ever-fluctuating way of being, rather than conceiving of subjectivity as something that can be accomplished, achieved, or capable of being mastered. I sing myself into being. I am a song without an end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jane, for this. Our next presentation, and afterwards we will have time for some questions and comments before moving on to the last two presentations. And by the way, if you would like to line up for questions or comments, you could already start doing so in the chat. I will keep an eye on this. But before we go to questions and comments, we are going to hear from Véronique Rousseau, who's from the PhD in Interdisciplinary Humanities, on methods as experimental/experiential apparatuses. Apparatuses. Véronique.
Yeah, apparatuses, I believe, is the English word. But thank you, Christine, and the Humanities Research Institute for organizing this seminar. As someone who has always felt at ease with the weird, I'm grateful for the opportunity. Oops, sorry, this is not the page I wanted. As my title suggests, I considered a method as a rigorous process of inquiry into experiences. I define experiences very broadly. In defining experiences very broadly, I've adopted a new materialist framework, since I grant the possibility of experiences to non-human entities, including concepts, actually. So following Jane Bennett, I argue that things have trajectories, propensities, and tendencies of their own that the scientific experimental process aims to discover, or at least engage with. And this nuance between discovery and engagement is central to my argument today. In what I'll call the discovery model, most aligned with technoscience and traditional humanism, the object under study is assumed to pre-exist and be independent from researcher, who organize experiments in which they can manipulate variables. Knowledge is deduced via the control exerted within the experimental setup and is deemed meaningful insofar as it can be reproduced and measured and instrumentalized. The engagement model, most aligned with posthumanist worldview, assumes instead that outcomes are produced by the processes that allow them to exist. This dynamic ontoepistemology assumes that reality and knowledge are constituted through the or as Karen Barrett prefers, intra-action of various participants. In the engagement model, concept, method, experimental equipment, measuring device, and observer, just to name the most obvious components, all contribute to generate a perceivable phenomena. The engagement model is a paradigmatic shift away from the discovery model. While generally accepted in the post-humanities and actively pursued in method-like research creation, the engagement model is still, to my understanding, considered weird in data-driven disciplines. In culture at large, the engagement model might not even be recognized as a valid way of knowing. For the engagement model poses a fundamental challenge to what knowledge is, especially given that scholars and academics have historically defined knowledge as a neutral and universally applicable. While both models are committed to rigorous observation, the engagement model is the only one to acknowledge that observation is a form of intervention with productive effects. This is all quite abstract. At this point, please allow me to engage in transversal or diffractive thinking to illustrate my argument. The concept of diffraction, originally from physics, is used by both Barrett and Haraway as a way to disrupt the assumption that science and discourse actually reflects reality. In physics, diffraction is the outcome of an encounter between two phenomena, for example, two waves which amplify or nullify each other. For critical theory, this means that matter and discourse affects each other, neither one having precedence on the other. And that is the encounter of matter and discourse that produces a differentiated phenomenon. Because my work experience has spanned three disparate fields of academia, finance, and craft making, I've asked myself, what methodological practices do these disciplines share? While quite different, these three practices share a commitment to seeking patterns within matter, and those patterns leads to theory, which then articulate and shape action. A specific case study I would like to propose: on the left, the Niels Bohr's two-slip experiment, as popularized by Karen Barrett, from which physicists conclude that life behaves and therefore is both a particle and a wave, depending on the mise en scène of the experiment, i.e. the apparatus. These incompatible results are as objective and reproducible as hard science can produce. Yet their interpretation leads to the discovery that, and I quote Barrett in their seminal Meeting the Universe Halfway, the nature of the observed phenomena changes with the corresponding change in the apparatus. In the same work, Barrett defined apparatuses as the material discursive practices, causal interaction through which matter is iteratively and differentially articulated. Or in other words, practices of mattering through which intelligibility and materiality are constituted. I propose to apply this definition to the example on the right, a crochet sample. This craft is a straightforward example of an apparatus that creates an object through an engaged subject. The maker starts with thread and then produce a fabric by using a tool with which they perform a series of repeated actions. I note that the appearance, i.e. characteristic of the output, differs significantly depending on the apparatus, including the size of the crochet, and that discourse affect how this knowledge is valued. Because there is no associated meaning in a crochet pattern, and within technoscience, we often relegate this type of know-how to machines, it is generally devalued, even if in some contexts, and historically, knowing how to make fabric was more important than knowing the indeterminate nature of atoms. I claim that these two examples are archetype of each model, yet the socially privileged method, the normal research, is actually in a messy hybrid between physics and craft, which most often does not acknowledge this assumption and limitation. I exemplify this case by finance and economics, which create wealth, knowledge, and ideologies by locating patterns within quantitative data, which are the traces left by entities such as individual and corporation. In quantitative, and to a lesser extent qualitative research methods, human individual are still conceptualized as atoms acting independently within the complex system of society, just like in the physical discovery model. Yet individuals are agent. They engage in the creation of their behavior, even while being ongoingly affected by the possibility inherent to their environment and circumstances. So just like in craft, a maker engage with the potentiality of its material. Meanwhile, economics attempts to study the interaction and entanglement of market participants. Yet only some action leaves quantitative traces in the ceaselessly changing charts of the market. Giving an ongoing privileging of quantitative data, many practices that do not easily translate into economic patterns get devalued. As the adage goes, one cannot manage what one can't measure. Yet researching only measurable interaction leads to distorted knowledge, which then produces a distorted reality. The fact that we cannot measure everything, including the distortion that measurement mechanisms create, doesn't absolve us as researchers to acknowledging that our choices of apparatus matter. Foucault uses the term dispositive to denote a social apparatus in which an heterogeneous ensemble of discourse, institutions, law, scientific statement, philosophical and moral proposition, etc., functions to describe, make perceivable, and ultimately regulate behavior. Because my time is running out, I'll just suggest that socio-economic apparatuses and dispositive might be more akin to crochet pattern than we wish to acknowledge. An individual reproduces the concepts and value embedded within the pattern as if it was following a recipe. Yet as agents, maker materially create this pattern within reality, which may or may not be measurable within the dominant apparatus, such as data-driven economics. Yet as engaged agent and reality maker, we could at any moment stitch our reality slightly differently by changing methods, tools, and norms within the range of possibilities available within our material discursive milieu. In conclusion, I'd argue that weird methods like this diffractive thinking allow researchers to practice a more honest engagement with reality, with knowledge, and with each other. This method of thinking with the agencies of concept, what Elizabeth St. Pierre called post-qualitative inquiry, is arguably more methodological than normal research because of, and only insofar as it requires a rigorous observation of the experience of thinking. This weird method, which I've considered an agent within this presentation, has required me to acknowledge the effect of the mediating apparatuses and dispositive that participate in the phenomena that we call knowledge. It has also asked of me to be brave and epistemically humble in acknowledging the limits of engaged knowledge. Yet I wonder whether this practice is really that weird, because in effect, this thinking through with care might actually be what philosophizing is meant to be. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Véronique. Now we will take some time to take comments, questions before moving on to David's presentation and then my presentation. So I'll let people gather their thoughts a little.
I have questions for our panelists just to kind of get things going. Those were really stimulating presentations. Thank you so much. It struck me that in each case in various ways, each of you are sort of articulating the fact that there's dominant epistemological perspectives, ways of knowing that claim hardness, for example, in sort of sciences, you're suggesting, Véronique, normative ways of kind of approaching subjectivity, Jane, that are based on kind of an identitarian premise, or Ada kind of talking about modes of the ways in which we think about the non-tomato as being sort of more prevalent and central. So the weirdness seems to be predicated on a centrality with which we're all differentiating ourselves in some way. Would that be a kind of a way in of thinking about what's happening in each of your thinking and practices, is that there's this differentiating occurring from an existing norm that is somehow claiming too much space via a sort of an authoritativeness that isn't warranted? Any thoughts there?
I worry about this question. so I share it, and then I also I'm concerned about it. What I hear in your question is an invitation to reflect on the defensiveness. Is there a defensiveness? No,
okay. No, but less defensiveness and more just like, what we're talking about possibly is subjugated ways of thinking, or ways of thinking that have been rendered weird, that they aren't necessarily weird, but they've been constructed as outside a norm. And this is sort of work that's saying, hey folks, let's sort of look at the premises of what constitutes the norm and what has been constructed as weird, and let's sort of own weirdness as this counter gesture in some sense. So, but I didn't pick up any defensiveness in any of your kind of approaches, either rhetorically or polemically. No. So it was more just about that sort of that which has been constructed as the outside way of knowing is going, okay, actually we're not as quite outside, and there's a real, this is actually perhaps a more flexible and appropriate and central way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to me, methods in just as a general category is a legitimating mechanism, and hence it comes with authorities and an institution that has developed norms over time, and that might have ossified, and the gesture toward weird or introducing kind of strange compare and contrast in my case is to reintroduce the flux within that knowledge making institution.
Yeah, that came across really strongly.
Yeah, I think I agree with both Ada and Véronique, and I found that in approaching this kind of thinking, it was, I don't know, I kind of had some difficulty distinguishing what is conceived even as weird without just kind of creating a binary between like normal and abnormal, but perhaps seeing it like Véronique, like in a flux of something in such a way that doesn't really reinstate that kind of binary of being normal, abnormal, weird, not weird. So I think exploring those potentials for research ways that aren't necessarily like weird just on their own, but exactly like David had said, in a kind of framework where there's already been a norm established for things to be considered weird. Yeah.
It seems to me that across those presentations, there's certainly an implicit, if not explicit at times, challenge to the epistemic authority that has been constructed with those norms, right? And so, for example, Jane, when you were talking about paying attention to vibration and how a vibrating body cannot be that rigid body that we've been thinking about or wanting to cling to, right? And so in many ways, that's what's weird. It's to think of a rigid body engaged in singing when there's so much going on that makes it not rigid, right? And so, yeah, so a challenge to that kind of authority that has emerged and consolidated and sort of reproduces itself through the various institutions and practices we engage in. I see Ada wanting to jump in here.
Oh, sorry, I'm getting excited. Weird bodies like to move and get excited about things. I was interested in connecting to Maya's wonderful question in the chat. And I think it might connect with David's question as well. So could we define weird specifically in relation to particular disciplines as what talks back or has a kind of recalcitrant resistance in relation to the norms, such that those norms become recognizable as weird themselves? So that's what I'm so drawn to. I love how, so for instance, I work on placebos, and one of the things that's so delicious about placebos is that they are invoked as a control to purify the data. In a lot of ways, it's the ultimate non-weird protocol, a placebo control. However, placebos leak in all over the place. They're only there as a control because of all the weirdnesses. We can't control placebos. We can't predict when they're going to happen. Even weirder is the negative, the nocebo, where harm and injury really does happen. Our bodies manifest the sense that something bad is going to happen, even in the context, sometimes because of the controls. So you sign a consent form to participate in an experimental trial, and you're getting a placebo, but you will still have the side effects because you signed that side. So weird, so weird. But isn't it interesting, the perspective or the methods we need to draw out the weirdness?
Absolutely.
I am muted. Okay. I thought we could.
I'd like to say something on Maya's question as well, if at all possible. I think the weird will depend on the discipline, but one way to define weird, and when I explained to my husband when I first met, I said I was weird, and by that I meant that I was extraordinary, not my most humble moment, but there was a lot of extra to the ordinary. And this is what I wanted to say, is that there's actually the main size, the main kind of principles of normal research, which is observation, and analytical scrutiny. And, there's all of this normal, and then there's just so much more extra that are allowed to come in and be expressed. And so that is kind of my preferred definition of weird.
Véronique, I wonder, and I wonder if instead of normal, we might want to use conventional, because I think the use of normal takes us into a whole other realm of what counts as, like normal, abnormal, and maybe
normal also derives from the normative.
Yes.
And the authoritarian. So I don't want to go to abnormal,
but that the conventional would follow some norms is a lot of what we're dealing with. And that, by the way, connects with a comment that was made in the chat, and I'm just going to read it before we move on. So a comment: we struggle with being perceived as doing weird research in dramatic arts and find ourselves having to legitimize ourselves because we often fall outside of the so-called normal research in the university system, right? So what gets to be recognized as following the norms, following the conventions and whatnot, right? So that is certainly part of the larger conversation. Yeah. I think that's a nice segue to David Fancy's presentation. David, who's a wonderful colleague from dramatic arts and is going to talk to us about geomancy and technomancy, resonance, divination, and simondon. David, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. I am going to share my screen. And I'm going to tell you a little story before I jump into a couple of sort of remarks that I'll read out. I do something weird on a regular basis, where I learned many moons ago to use coat hangers or sticks of wood to detect things, underline water 10 or 15 feet underground, objects that have been buried, beneficial and unbeneficial sort of earth energy lines. And a couple of weeks ago, for example, I got a call from a friend, and they said, listen, we have an 18-month-old baby, and the baby's not slept properly for 18 months. Could you please come and find out if there's negative energy that the child is sleeping on. So sure enough, I went and I brought up my coat hangers and I found these, what's called a geopathic stress cross line that this child's crib was on, and moved it to a different location in the room that didn't have any of these lines on it. And as I was doing this, it struck me funny knowing this event was coming up. There was the sort of the teenage sibling of this child in the corner of the room watching this said, "What a weirdo," to her mother about me. So I thought that was really funny. But the child reportedly, and I just checked in today just so I would have up-to-date empirical data for us, has slept the full night through every night since. So since I do this, I'm really interested in theorizing and understand how we can think through how this actually works, or at least theorize it. So I've got a piece coming out in a book called Posthuman Symbiotic Ecologies shortly, and the piece is called Geomancy, and geomancy is this work of divination using the power of the earth, versus technomancy, which technomancy, which is sort of technological modes of magic, resonance, divination, simondon. So it's a long piece and it's part of a longer project. So I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs really. And introduce us to some ideas around how we can think about this weird activity and bringing in by extension, some of the sort of notions of weirdness in epistemological kind of approaches and theoretical approaches that we've been talking about. So geomancy is a divinatory and resonative genre, both in its practice, but also in the way in which it thinks. Although presenting characteristically in the economic north, in its vestigial form as a dowser, holding a Y-shaped piece of wood to seek a previously undetected underground water source, the geomancer, etymologically anchored in the geo, as well as manteia or magic, has taken many different forms over human history. As geomancers, the Chinese feng shui master seeks to avoid dragon lines of unbeneficial energy in the placement of housing. The Celtic druid co-creating ley lines of energy beneficial to living systems. The Arab geomancer using the science of sand to intuit information pertaining to living and physical systems alike. Not to mention energy workers or shamans from practically every indigenous heritage. Each of these practitioners are part of what's been described as the oldest, continually practiced, scholarly geographic practice in the world. There's no rhyme nor reason to these images. They're just sort of show dowsers at work and dowsers as they've been represented historically. The geomancer's mode of divination is intuitive rather than psychic, and is therefore less concerned with discerning the future, focusing instead on the ability to access and crystallize the complex availabilities and relationalities of any particular present moment. As such, the geomancer can be described, following Gilles Deleuze, as proceeding via an apprenticeship in signs, using prostheses such as sticks of wood, metal rods, or other objects to amplify and render visible information available in multiple energetic realms, constituting perceived material reality. So proceeding gnosiologically, so gnosis, sort of knowledge from within, rather than epistemologically in a traditional sense, the geomancer resonates or feels their way through the world in order to bring events and arrangements seemingly unknowable from the perspective of classical empiricism and its scientific descendants into awareness and into the world. This work of divination recalls Deleuze's affirmation that, quote, "we must be Egyptologists in our reading of science." An important invitation, especially in the context of the Anthropocene, where we, as a species, we struggle to read, discern, and engage with the complex ecologies of which we find ourselves part. From an ontological perspective in which, as Deleuze emphasizes, everything is implicated, everything is complicated, everything is sign meaning essence, the geomancer is well positioned to decipher as well as generate new patterns and connections that can counter humanist logics of supremacy and all of its manifestations in colonialism, patriarchy, etc., to help stimulate more complex ecological relationalities in response to a planet as a result of human actions that's becoming increasingly inhospitable to human life. These years, geomancers find themselves in an interesting world historical moment. Technomancy reigns supreme as a practice of capitalist dissemblance via the conceptual fusion of technology as magic or mentea, either in the necromantic mode of capitalism as a kind of sorcery, or its doubly fabulated form across a range of popular fictional expressions, such as video games, role-playing games, TV, fiction, films, etc. Many technomantic expressions, I argue in the longer work, are complicit in the mystification and fetishization of the allegedly unlimited potentials of techno-capital, when these alleged potentials are instead simply an anxious, limited set of established possibilities bound by the dual logics of binary code on one hand and the extraction of value in the form of affect, attention, and material labor, personal data on the other. The figure of the geomancer, not simply disavowing technology via a romantic gesture, intuits digital technology's deep imbrication with capital. Instead of proceeding via resonative capture and exploitation, the figure of the geomancer attempts to find ways of connecting more broadly and without a mobilizing logic of dominance or supremacy with the earth itself and all of its inhabitants. In this way, the geomancer is both a geophilosopher in the Deleuze-Guattarian sense, who invokes a politics of sorcery, as well as a geo-artist who brings new realities into the world, proceeding via speculative and quasi-causal gestures of artistry and divination. Given that the geomancer oscillates in a complex symbiotic resonance with a potentially whole host of intersecting ecologies, in a longer work, I begin by introducing an entire field of thought dealing with matters of resonance in which the geomancer engages. And I'll just finish with a paragraph that suggests that I'd like to posit the figure of the geomancer, and these are some sort of popular expressions of the geomantic that counter the technomantic in the popular imagination of video games and role-playing games. The figure of the geomancer is both a conceptual form as well as a mode of practice that seeks to evade and counter the cadence of advanced technocapital as captured in the electromagnetic fields and frequencies. The geomancer harnesses resonance differently than via the necromantics of the technomancer, not by constructing divination as a process of projective, inscrutable magic. Instead, the figure of the geomancer proceeds by divining all of these repressed earth frequencies in a ways that turns divination into a form of rendering intelligible or reading or bringing forth, at least momentarily, of patterns and events via quasi-magical means. This is a different magic and divination than the projective magic of aspirational control and supremacy than the technomancer that's irrevocably marked by its monstrous and metastatic familiar or capitalism. And so that is my suggestion of inviting this particular figure in as a way of thinking through how we can have these complex relationalities with things that we might not otherwise see.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. There was a comment about how the background moving image was could possibly induce dizziness in some people. And I sort of agree. At some point, I stopped looking because it was a bit too much going on, but interesting to have this kind of movement in the background, which is what you're going for in your paper, right? Like trying to identify these resonances and whatnot.
Yeah, I thought it was just a cute PowerPoint. I hope that, thanks Dan for warning us of yet another risk of techno-capital, right? These nice PowerPoints that can make people sick.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's all kinds of warnings. Yeah, there's all kinds of warnings now on almost every show I watch about flashing lights, and sometimes I look for them because they're so not obvious. Okay, so we now turn to my presentation, which is, I'm just looking to share here my screen. Here we go. Yes. So my presentation, Posthumanism and Postdisciplinarity, Breaking Our Old Research Habits. The world is in turmoil, to say the least. We are confronted daily with crises, environmental, medical, political, ethical, and cultural, etc. Worst, we seem to be making the same mistakes and not learning from the past. We need to rethink and change how we produce and disseminate knowledge. To arrive at new thoughts, which are urgently needed, we must change the conditions in which we create our thoughts. We need to defamiliarize our mental habits and open ourselves to alternate modes of research. This is what the Posthumanities, as postdisciplinary, stand for. The humanities scholar is most often imagined alone, surrounded by books and deep in thought. I used to quip that my methodology section for grant applications ought to be a model for conciseness. I read, I think, I write. In the humanities, the research model that is typically pursued is that of individually producing conference papers that become articles and then monographs. This model is pursued because it is the one that is valued in the profession, be it by immediate peers, deans, and other administrators who may grant tenure and promotion or not, grant adjudication committees, as well as peers in the field more broadly. To say that my discipline, philosophy, tends to be conservative in this regard is an understatement. So we need to use different means of dissemination to address pressing current issues. We need to engage in and give value to alternate forms of dissemination that make research widely available to researchers and the general population internationally. We need to make better use of social media platforms and tools like podcasts, live streaming, blogs, and others, so that ideas can circulate and not remain stuck in the ivory tower of academe collecting dust. By generating models for dissemination that can make insights more readily available, we will also allow the humanities to keep up with the sciences and technology. You may have seen the meme that is up on the slide. However, if the humanities constantly lag behind because of a cumbersome and slow publication process and resistance to alternate modes of dissemination, the dinosaur might very well be cloned before we get the occasion to warn the scientists. Also, would it not be better if the scientists and humanists were engaged in a conversation all along? We also need to change our individual stance from that of posing as an expert to that of a humble thinker, a tough requirement for academics. What I mean by that is that we need to be willing to take risks and present material that is still cooking in the back of our minds. A colleague criticized Achille Mbembe's short essay, The Universal Right to Breathe, that was published by Critical Inquiry on their blog, In the Moment. The colleague claimed it was interesting, but choppy. Definitely not a quality in their mind. But the piece had been written in response to the emergency of the pandemic, and while choppy, was certainly provoking and thoughtful. I would say that Mbembe dared to be humble in this case and offer choppy yet crucial thoughts in order to advance our collective thinking. I would say we need to be humble in yet another way and acknowledge that the thoughts we have and theories we put forward are not the product of isolated activity and our sole genius. We're not a lonely tomato. We're part of that bowl that Ada was presenting earlier. The model we are working with, however, does imply that we form our thoughts in isolation and that the material environments in which we form them are irrelevant. By adopting this model, we deprive ourselves of valuable input in our thinking processes that can potentially lead to better theorizing. A posthumanist material feminist stance that considers all beings, human and non-human, as deeply entangled can help us with this realization. Marilyn Strayton claims that it matters what ideas we use to think other ideas. In her Staying with the Trouble, Donna Haraway spins this claim by giving it many different and really interesting iterations. The point is that ideas are assemblages that emerge from the various entanglements with each other, various entanglements in which we exist and that we ourselves are. Ideas spring from the dynamic material engagements with each other and the world. Therefore, our manner of engaging, the very practices we adopt to think, feel, experience, and theorize matter a great deal, as do the settings in which we think. Karen Barrett points out, knowing does not come from standing at a distance and representing, but rather from a direct material engagement with the world. And the way in which we engage shapes our knowing. I believe that collaborative, post-disciplinary, and cross-sectoral research projects are the most likely to yield the new ideas we need. The work we do at the Posthumanism Research Institute and the activities we organize seek to adopt non-conventional modes of knowledge creation. One example is the collaborative work we did with a theater company on a SSHRC-funded partnership. As part of this partnership, we held a workshop at Brock in February 2020, yes, just before the pandemic hit us. Now, in preparation for the workshop, all participants did common readings so we could all share a theoretical basis. The morning provided academics a conventional, comfortable headspace in which 5 presentations were made and listened to. But after lunch, things took a turn under the lead of the playwright. Warm-up bodily exercises to warm up the body, connect with experiences of stimulus and impulse, to engage the imagination, and to warm up the connection between participants. Another purpose for that specific group of academics was to signal that they were going to engage in thinking in a significantly different way than what they were used to. After that, all participants were asked to form teams of 3, preferably with individuals they did not know well, so as to be confronted with different ideas. They were tasked with drawing a life-size posthuman, using paper from a roll and drawing the silhouette of a team member on it. They were to think of which features to retain and which to enhance, and why, drawing those features on the paper. The life-size portrait was to be presented to the whole group, catwalk style, and to a song chosen by the team, followed by a brief explanation of the rationale for that posthuman. The second creative exercise of the afternoon involved the same teams working on a short scene to be staged in which they would explore a non-dystopian posthuman future. They were to create a storyline for up to 3 characters, rehearse it, and then perform it to the group. The research conducted that day represented forays in ontology, epistemology, and ethics, as we sought to reconceive the human from a posthumanist perspective. Shaking up the methods, engaging in creative exercises atypical of philosophical research endeavors, opened our minds individually and collectively, and allowed us to formulate ideas in a way that a traditional setting may not have been favorable to. I also want to mention generative alternative ideas used by colleagues whom I wish to emulate. That day, Dr. Karen Hull from Guelph told us about how she takes her graduate philosophy of nature class to the field to plant onions and care for them as they grow. Dr. Astrida Nemanis, a friend of mine, organized a field trip in Australia, taking academics on a train ride to a mine and hosting talks given by speakerphone on that train, addressing both academics and other passengers. Why can't we have talks on the GO train? What would happen then? In one blog entry on the pandemic, pondering whether philosophy can offer any help, Marie-Claude Saverchel described the times we live in as a boiling pot, in which we are faced with an onslaught of information and opinions on the situation, which constitute what she calls a state of cacophony. The urgency with which thinkers are disseminating their sometimes less than polished ideas so that a conversation and the creation of ideas can occur is fascinating. As I see it, it points to the limiting and constraining nature of the lonely scholar in their study model. Collaborative thinking, such as the one that can occur when we meet and discuss our ideas, be it at a workshop, in a classroom, online at a meeting, in co-authoring settings, creating an artwork, experimenting with methods, or in a few minutes in a breakout room. This all enhances thought generation processes. One is a better thinker when one can engage in collaborative thinking and in creative activities. Deprived of real life encounters and their generative possibilities, thinkers have been seeking replacements via the academic cacophony we are experiencing. This is all a good thing, and another way for humanities disciplines to shake their old habits and perhaps realize widely the benefits of breaking with the cherished humanist model. Thank you. Okay, I have successfully stopped sharing my screen, I think, yes. Okay, well, thanks for your attention on these presentations. And before we go to breakout rooms, I will see if there are questions or comments. I see there are some in the chat. So there is a comment here. Instead of weird, what about the definition or concept, the between of indecidability? In other words, the experiencing of the between requires remaining in a state of unknowing to see what emerges, a state beyond order, chaos, and the symbolic / semiotic. And that was a comment that was made earlier, but I think it continues to apply to what we've been discussing. So, David, did you have any thoughts on this? The between, the notion of the between, the undecidability.
Yeah, first of all, apologies for some noise that was coming out. I had to switch computers. The in-betweenness possibility, sort of notions of the liminal. The challenge I always have with notions of the in-between is that it posits to extant individuated phenomena, and there's an in-between that's organized as a liminal or interstitial space. And sometimes that doesn't always do the requisite work of displacing the notion of centrality, anchor, the logocentric, the normative, right? So it could be a place of in-between, a place of transition. A term that I think has been used regularly to discuss some of the types of things that we're talking about is when we discuss the queering of disciplines, for example. And I think a productive discussion to be had would be to look at the overlap and differences between conceptualizations of weirdness and of queerness.
Yeah, and I was debating, you know, I think if it wasn't me, then call me to order, but I think it was me who came up with the idea of the weird research. And I was debating whether to call it weird research or queer research or queering research. And I think what I was trying to capture with using weird instead of queer was the idea that one may feel completely legitimate in one's endeavors. One may think that one is doing ontology while drawing a posthuman on a sheet of paper, but it's really someone else from an outside perspective posing as the embodiment of norms of a discipline that would perceive that as weird, right? Someone walking in on our workshop would have been confused if they were expecting this to be a philosophy or an ontology workshop, because there were people on the floor drawing things, and how could you be calling this ontology? That's weird, right? Yeah. So the people engaged in it at the moment are not feeling that it's weird. They may be queering. So queering might be something that one embraces and wants to put to work in one's approach. but the weirdness,
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, and this is why I wanted to have the conversation, because I wanted to see what people think is weird.
You know, and to a certain extent, I mean, I resist the whole notion of weirdness in the first place, because on some level it gives credence to the notion of a center that's making judgments about the peripheral, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, and I think those are important things to think about in terms of, you know, what is it that we consider to be a core or a disciplinary practice and a norm, right? We were talking about norms earlier. How did they come to be norms, and why are they celebrated as norms, and why can't we allow for divergence from said norm, and is it divergence at all in itself, right? Or is it just yet another way of engaging with thinking and with our object of research and something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering if there are other colleagues here who have other sort of thoughts about how there may be elements of the sort of emergent concept of weirdness as it intersects with their own research or their own work. Or, you know, if, again, and I experienced this when this teenager called me a weirdo when I was doing some dowsing work in her young sibling's house. And so the notion of weirdness is sort of the construction or othering, or there can be an element of ostracism or shaming there. So perhaps we do research, as Danielle was suggesting earlier in the comments, that is not necessarily sort of posited or articulated central in some way. And so how do we do the work of continuing with conviction on our research pathways, even though it is perhaps non-normative? And does one embrace or affirm the difference? Does one feel the pressure institutionally or from a granting agency of sort of coming within a normative view? I mean, there's lots of sort of pressures on peripheral work that don't sort of fulfill certain sort of what the mandate of the season might be.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to address that in my presentation, to say, well, we're faced with these pressures, right? There are certain expectations, there are certain things, there are certain activities that are valued. And so if we're going to engage and say, oh, it's good to engage in these alternate modes, well, we need to value that work and its various outcomes, which may not take the shape that we're used to, right? Like what we see in your background, like all the very good academic books, that those are valuable, but there's other stuff that can be as valuable and differently.
Precisely.
Yeah. David says it can also be an intentional choice to position in the other. You were talking about othering, David. Yes.
Yeah, David Vivian,
Yeah. If there are no other questions or comments, and I'm scanning through the chat and I don't see a raised hand, so maybe we can move on to the breakout rooms. So we are going to, as announced at the beginning, it is our intention to produce a weird research manifest, and perhaps weird will fall on the wayside and something else will take its place, who knows, or maybe a definition of weird will be generated in this manifesto. But so we have the intention of working on this collaboratively, and we're seeking your input. So we want to hear about your experiences, what you're thinking even about what counts as weird. What does weird do that non-weird does not? Why be weird, or why weird research, or maybe use queer instead, and you know, talking about norms and conventions and whatnot. So the value of engaging in dissonant types of research. So we're going to stop the recording now. Thank you for your attention, and we're going to move to breakout rooms to discuss these questions.